created Bitcoin? It's been a mystery since its inception. The cryptocurrency founder has publicly posted on chat boards under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, but now an award-winning investigative journalist believes he has unmasked the blockchain creator. A decade ago, his work exposed the fraud of Elizabeth Holmes, and now John Carreyrou believes he has sufficient evidence to confidently name the Bitcoin creator as Adam Back. Originally from London, and now living on the island of Malta, he is a PhD cryptologist and programmer, and has long been a probable Satoshi candidate. However, Adam Back's official position is, and I quote, "Clearly, I'm not Satoshi, that's my position." Well, whoever Bitcoin's creator is, exposure could be costly. I can't help but recall how when Pilate asked Jesus if he truly was the king of the Jews, he did not deny it and was willing to pay the ultimate cost to bring us salvation. Welcome to Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, sharing the great story that's all about Jesus, and we're continuing in a series we began last week called The Story Behind the Hymn. All last week, we visited with pastor and author Robert Morgan, thinking about the great hymns of the Christian faith, and we also heard some of the backstories that led to the creation of the great hymns. But all of those hymns put the focus on the Lord rather than on us, and as my guest last week, Robert Morgan, said, that is what matters most, and I agree.
The older I get, David, the more I'll want to sing songs that are about God and not about me. To sing immortal, invisible, God only wise, and light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing his power and his love. Those are the songs that help me the most. I need my songs of worship to focus more on God than on me, and the whole aspect of majesty and reverence and the awe and the fear of God that we should have is lost to us in a lot of the music we're singing today. And I need to sing about God. I need to sing about his lofty transcendence. Somehow that helps me more than singing about me.
That's pastor and author Robert Morgan. He'll be back with us in a moment to help tell the story of one of the greatest hymn writers in history. Isaac Watts is commonly referred to as the father of modern hymnody, and even if you don't recognize his name, chances are you'll recognize many of his hymns, like O God, our help in ages past, Jesus shall reign, when I survey the wondrous cross, and joy to the world. And he has many other hundreds of hymns besides. But what makes his story unique is that he was a trailblazer. He did what no one else in the English-speaking church was doing, and the Lord used him as a trailblazer to help light fires for the Great Awakening. It's an amazing story, and we'll tell it today. But first, I want you to know that you can have your own copy of Robert Morgan's brand new book, The Origin of Hymns. Much of what you'll hear today is contained within that book, but there's so much more. A total of 50 of the world's greatest hymns and their backstories. Each of the entries reads devotionally, and notably, this is the same book featured in the recent movie I Can Only Imagine 2. And we would love to send this book to you as our way of saying thank you for your gift of ministry support to Haven Today, which in turn helps share our hope in Christ with countless listeners in North America and around the world. So would you give us a call at 865-HAVEN? 865-HAVEN. Just be sure to request The Origin of Hymns when you give, or you can do all of that online at haventoday.org. haventoday.org. This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, and today we're going to hear the story of Isaac Watts. But to understand the story fully, we need some context. Today, for many Christians, there's a sense of respect for the worshipful reverence and the depth of awe in the great hymns. I share in that sentiment. But what's interesting is that the church didn't always feel that way about hymns. In fact, there was a time when singing a hymn was seen as radical and inappropriate for Christian worship. That might seem a little odd, especially considering what the Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians 3:16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Why would singing a hymn be radical? What the church sings today, in fact, I think you could categorize in those three buckets. But what did psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs mean to the early church, especially in a time that preceded bound hymn books and music notation and praise choruses? Well, the answer is nobody knows. But what we do know is that at the time of the Reformation, hymn singing was championed by Martin Luther and by the German reformers. Luther himself wrote, "A mighty fortress is our God." But others, like Zwingli and Calvin, strongly opposed the singing of hymns. They believed the only songs appropriate for Christian worship were those taken directly from the biblical text, and especially from the Psalms. And the vast majority of English-speaking churches took this position as well. And so, for more than 100 years, they sang only from the metrical psalter. Basically, that was an adaptation of the Psalms, but put into meter and verse. For example, Psalm 23 sounded like this: "The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie. In pastures green he leadeth me, the quiet waters by." Well, I often hear people lament the lack of hymn singing these days, but we might consider lamenting the near total absence of singing the Psalter. This is beautiful, but as a minority of Christians believed then, there was something lacking. There were no hymns or spiritual songs. So the pressure dialed up even more in 1662. That was when the British Parliament passed the Law of Uniformity. Then it became illegal for a church to meet that wasn't a state church using the Book of Common Prayer. It reminds me of the situation in China today, where the communist state has its three self-church. People are allowed to attend those, but every other church is therefore an underground, unregistered church where pastors preach and Christians attend at their own peril. Likewise, in England during this period, pastors were arrested and thrown in jail for preaching the gospel. Men like John Bunyan, who wrote The Pilgrim's Progress, or another young pastor, Benjamin Keach, who, as it turns out, paved the way for Isaac Watts to follow. So Keach was 22 years old when he was imprisoned for his preaching. He was then bloodied in the public pillory and then released, but that didn't stop his ministry. He went on to pastor a house church that met secretly for 10 years until in 1672 the law changed, and then dissenting churches, as they were called, were no longer illegal. Keach's church began to grow. They built a sanctuary that could seat almost 1,000 people, and his church was one of the first that began incorporating hymns. At first, it was just one hymn during the communion service. However, several years later, the church began including a single hymn at the end of every service, and they did it at the end so that anyone opposed to hymn singing could leave at that point. It was the year 1690 when Benjamin Keach published the first ever English hymnal. And it just so happens that same year, another soon-to-be preacher was 16 years old and heading off to his collegiate studies. This young man was Isaac Watts. Now, the genius of Isaac Watts was evident early on. By the age of 5, he had taught himself Latin. He had Greek down by the age of 8. By his 11th birthday, he was fluent in French, and by 13, Hebrew also. He had a lightning-quick mind. In fact, he got into trouble as a boy for his habit of rhyming his words in everyday conversation, which I think is hilarious. But one day his father was scolding him for doing this, and young Isaac Watts responded, "Oh, father, do some pity take, and I will no more verses make." Well, his father was a deacon in the dissenting church and had also been imprisoned for his faith. And this is the church where Isaac Watts grew up. And here I'm going to hand it over to my friend and guest from last week, Robert Morgan, who wrote the book, The Origin of Hymns. I invited him to share some highlights from the life of Isaac Watts.
I'm just astounded at this man, Isaac Watts. He was born in the 1700s. His father was a dissenter, which means that they didn't go to the Anglican Church in England. They went to an independent congregation. And so when Isaac, even though he was brilliant, wanted to go to college, there were only two universities in England at that time, Oxford and Cambridge, and neither one of them would accept him because he was a dissenter. So he ended up going to we would call it today a college, a Bible college in London. It's called Newington Academy, and there he studied Latin and Greek, Hebrew and mathematics and geography and science and ethics and religion, the Bible, law, theology, a very wide-ranging set of subjects. And he graduated at the age of 19, returned home, but he was too young to get a church to pastor anywhere. He was also very frail, and again, he was not Anglican, and so finding a place to minister was a little difficult. So he stayed at home. He went to the Above Bar Baptist Church in Southampton, England, with his parents. He didn't like the singing there very much because it was only the metrical psalms, so he began writing a hymn every week for them. And again, he was only 19 or 20, maybe 21 years old over this time period, and he wrote the greatest hymns you can imagine. And this church sang them. And later, he did become a prominent pastor in London. He became a great writer of many kinds of books. In fact, his textbooks were later used at Oxford and Cambridge, the two universities that had barred him from entering earlier. But it's Isaac Watts to whom we owe a debt of gratitude for songs like When I Survey the Wondrous Cross on which the Prince of Glory died. My richest gain I count but loss and pour contempt on all my pride. And this wonderful hymn of guidance, O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. Be thou our guide while life shall last, and our eternal hope.
O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home.
A little sample of the Isaac Watts hymn Robert Morgan just mentioned, O God, our help in ages past. You're listening to Haven Today. I'm David Wollen, and today we're telling the story of the man known as the Father of Hymnody. However, Isaac Watts never heard anyone call him that in his lifetime, and he probably would have been astonished if he had. Most of his time and energy was devoted elsewhere. He was a full-time pastor. He was occupied with the cure and care of souls through the gospel of Jesus Christ. But he also had a deep concern for sharing the gospel with the unreached, and the hymns he wrote helped accomplish that. The hymns, as we've established already, were considered radical, but also radical was the idea of what we'd call today missions. In the 1700s, foreign missions weren't even a concept for most churches. William Carey, who himself is considered the father of modern missions, was born 13 years after the death of Watts. And the Anglican Church of that day opposed Carey as well. One bishop said to Carey, "Young man, if God wants to save the heathen, he will do so without any help from you." Well, a full 60 years prior to that, Isaac Watts had penned the hymn, Jesus Shall Reign, based on Psalm 72, the missionary psalm. Just a couple of stanzas from that. Jesus shall reign where the sun does its successive journeys run. His kingdom stretch from shore to shore till moons shall wax and wane no more. Blessings abound where'er he reigns. The prisoners leap to loose their chains. The weary find eternal rest, and all who suffer want are blessed. Well, Isaac Watts was a man of many interests academically as well. He published various essays, 3 volumes of sermons, some 29 books on theology, and even a textbook on logic. Although he didn't publish any of his hymns until his brother, Enoch Watts, finally convinced him to do so in a letter that read, "Dear brother, In your last letter, you mentioned an inclination to oblige the world by showing it your hymns in print. And I heartily wish that you were something more than inclinable. There is a great need of a pen vigorous and lively as yours to quicken and revive the dying devotion of the age. And what he says next is striking to me. He writes, "Yours now is the old truth, stripped of its ragged ornaments, and appears, if we may say so, younger by ages in a new and fashionable dress." Now, what does he mean by that? I think you could put it like this. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the most ancient truth, but to the one who hears it new, it is new. So why is it old? Well, because the intention of the triune God was that the Son of God would go to the cross. This was the great mystery, hidden from the eyes of history, but foreordained since before the foundations of the earth were laid. And so Jesus Christ himself is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so the gospel likewise is ageless. And yet for all people, in all places and at all times, this old truth is vibrantly relevant. There is no culture in which the gospel cannot enter in like a skeleton key and turn the lock that sets the captive free from spiritual darkness. In the day of Isaac Watts, the established church had become increasingly dull and lifeless in so many places, and this only a few generations after the Protestant Reformation. In fact, during the 1700s in England, the Academy was predicting that Christianity would die out altogether by the end of the century. However, the Lord raised up people like John Bunyan, Benjamin Keach, and Isaac Watts. And the words and melodies of those hymns were bringing the gospel back into focus and helped to set the stage for what would become a massive revival. Watts would be on the leading edge of the Great Awakening. Later in life, he would be a great encourager to preachers and evangelists like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards in the colonies. Often they would exchange letters. Isaac Watts was thrilled to learn that the Spirit of God was moving powerfully across the Atlantic, just as he was in England and Scotland. And the Wesleys also were influenced massively by Isaac Watts. In fact, Charles Wesley, in terms of the volume of hymns written, he actually produced more than 10 times what Watts ever did, and yet he greatly admired the hymns that Watts wrote. So much so that Charles Wesley reportedly once said that he would trade all of his hymns for the privilege of having written "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross" by Watts. But like the faithful servant of Christ that he was, Watts was never overly impressed with himself. The glory belonged to Jesus. All his delight was in him. And reflecting on his accomplishments, he once wrote, "My design was not to exalt myself to the rank and glory of poets, but I was ambitious to be a servant to the churches and a helper to the joy of the meanest Christian." And by God's grace, that is the faithful legacy of the Father of Hymnody, Isaac Watts.
When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride.
When I Survey the Wondrous Cross by Isaac Watts. This is Haven Today. I'm David Wollen. These are more than mini biographies. These are testimonies to God's faithful work through his people with music and lyrics attached. And indeed, there is a story behind every great hymn of the faith, and those great hymns do what Paul says they do in Colossians. They teach and admonish us in all wisdom, helping the word of Christ to dwell in us richly. And the story you heard today can be found in The Origin of Hymns by Robert Morgan. There are 50 hymns, and their backstories included. They read devotionally, and uniquely in his book, Robert Morgan shares the story arc of how the church has sung our songs of worship throughout history up to present day. Such a refreshing read, perfect for a nightstand, a coffee table, or even as a gift. And it's our way of saying thank you for your support of Haven. 865-HAVEN is the number to call to make your one-time or monthly gift. 865-HAVEN, or you can go online, haventoday.org, haventoday.org. I'm David Wollen. Won't you come back again next time? We'll be keeping it all about Jesus. It's the great story here on Haven Today.